I'm Nathan Ponchard, this is Chasing Cars, and this is the 2022 Renault Arkana Intens. Now, globally, the Arkana sits alongside the Kadjar in Renault's sort of mid-level SUV model range. But in Australia, the Arkana supersedes the Kadjar because, well, not many people bought the Kadjar, and Renault thought that this coupe shape might be a little bit more appealing. It should be pointed out too that this is the most affordable coupe SUV in Australia by some margin. This Intens, which is the mid-spec model, starts at $37,490, and the next cheapest model it can kind of theoretically compete against is an Audi Q3 Sportback, and that starts at $51,800. So even this car with $750 worth of white metallic paint, which looks whiter than most Americans' teeth, and a $600 black roof and a $1,500 sunroof is only $43,440. So it's still $11,000 cheaper than the Q3. But I suppose we'll find out, does it feel $11,000 cheaper than a Q3? Now, under the Arkana sits Renault Nissan's CMF-B platform, which it shares with the new generation Captur and the Clio 5, unlike the Kadjar, which shares its underpinnings with the Nissan Qashqai, the old Qashqai, not the forthcoming new one. Now, what makes the Arkana slightly interesting, or slightly odd perhaps, is its sizing. Like, it's clearly a Renault. It has all of this sort of front design aesthetic that Renault's had for quite some years now. It's on the Koleos, it's on the Megane RS even, and yet the Arkana, which is meant to be smaller than the Koleos, sits on a 27-20mm wheelbase, which is shorter than the larger SUVs. So it'll be interesting to see whether that actually brings any kind of interior benefit. Now, this Intens model here is the mid-spec in Australia. There's a Zen below it and an RS line coming in January 2022, which will be a little bit more sporty looking, have a little bit more darker accents and dark coloured 18s, not these sort of polished face 18-inch wheels that this Intens has, which look quite good on this car. It has these cool LED headlights, LED Pure Vision is what Renault calls them, with these cool C-shaped daytime running lights as per many of its stablemates. And so, yeah, generally at the front of this car, you can tell it's identifiably a Renault. But as we move around to the side, it sort of takes on a form all of its own. I'm not entirely sure whether I love the shape of the Arkana or I find it a little bit unusual. It is slightly odd in its proportion in that it is very long and reasonably wide, but the body tapers quite a lot through this section here, and it also sits almost 200mm off the ground. So even though it's only front-wheel drive, it has a better ground clearance than a ton of actual SUVs that people think they might be able to go off-roading in. So, interesting. The Intens also has these black mirror caps, the optional black roof, as I pointed out, these beautiful 18-inch alloy wheels, and then around the back here, it continues that Renault design aesthetic with these LED red lights that run and band across the back of the car, which gives it an element of expense, although that probably isn't a word they would use to describe the way the Arkana looks. It doesn't look cheap, but it doesn't look like a Q3 Sportback. It has probably a bit too much body detailing, in my opinion, to really give it that sort of punch. It's one facelift away from being a bit classier. Now, when you stand at the back here and look at it, you can see what I mean. It has quite a narrow turret, but quite a broad tail. And so it does give it an element of chic because it is kind of the only affordable coupe SUV, but I don't know, it's just a little bit weird. In here, we have a fairly large boot, which looks large already, but this floor actually comes out and goes down a level and gives this thing 485 litres of boot space, which is like medium SUV rivaling or beating in many cases. Like, it's huge. At the upper level, you can flop the 60/40 backrest down, it'll give a fully flat floor, but you may as well just leave it here and enjoy the space. Now we have a little plastic bin here to put wet things, but that's kind of it. There is nothing in here other than a boot light, but maybe simplicity is a good thing. I don't know, I think a few hooks would have been nice. Anywho, let's see how the inside goes. Inside the Arkana, the first thing you notice is the star of the show. In this Intens, it's a 9.3-inch portrait touchscreen, which, like the new Captur, sits up and tall in the middle of the dashboard. The Zen below it gets a 7-inch landscape one, but this and the RS line above it get this cool little thing here. And it's easily the slickest thing in this car. It works really well, which is something that no one ever said about Renault's old R-Link one in the past. Now, it has wired Apple CarPlay plug-in at the moment, but you can easily flick between a whole bunch of different systems. Now, it also has a whole bunch of buttons along the bottom here that makes pushing everything a lot easier. One of them here that looks like a little sort of snowflake is the multi-sense system. That means you can switch between sport and eco and stuff, change some of the driving parameters, but not the powertrain, which is slightly annoying. We'll come to that later. You can also go in and change the lighting, and so change the ambient lighting that runs around the dashboard and the doors here from 8 different colors. You can change the instrument cluster. It's all pretty easy. There's also, in this Intens model, a sort of seat button here that looks like a seat cooking. It's actually the seat heating and ventilation. And even though you do have to push a bunch of buttons to get it to happen, you press it here, you turn the drivers on, and you've got heating and fan cooling right here, and same for the passenger, and you can have them kind of on and off. The stereo in this car is actually a Bose surround sound one, but that won't be standard on these cars. It's just what is in the first batch of models coming here. Everything will have a 6-speaker Arkana auditorium sound stereo. I can't say that I've listened to that, but this one sounds pretty strong and fits in with the slickness of this overall screen. As for the rest of the interior, it's sort of like a less boring Kadjar, if you can understand what that means. The steering wheel is Renault's new generation one that has a different boss, and finally moves the cruise control rocker switch from down here, which has probably pissed people off for generations, is now on the steering wheel right here with the speed limiter, which makes it odd when you expect it to be here, but easy when you don't. The driving position in the car is actually pretty good. You do sit quite high, so combined with that ground clearance that's already nearly 200 millimeters, you do get an SUV sense of vision in the car. This Intens has 8-way electric front seats. It also has leather facings with perforation and some suede up the top here, and they do feel really nice. Initially quite firm and not so cushy, but after a while they actually prove to be really supportive and excellent over longer distances. The rest of the interior is nicely put together, but it doesn't necessarily carry an element of class all the way through it. So unlike this car's mainstream competitors, which is Mazda CX-30 and Volkswagen T-Roc, the Arkana has elements of chic, but the deeper you look, the more inexpensive it appears. For example, the top of the dash is quite smooth, not so squishy, but nicely molded and fits in well with this sort of faux turned aluminium in the dash. And continuing that sort of nicely put together story is this stitching that runs along the door trim here. You've got the same in the door armrests, even though they're quite hard. They do have a little bit of padding, but minimal. The tops of the doors aren't rock hard, but once you go down the tide line, the plastics turn to sort of hard and cheap. They may not be easily scratched, but they certainly look like they're meant to be hard wearing rather than luxurious. And this thing here just fits into the door here, but I tried to get a 1 litre camping bottle in the door yesterday and it just wouldn't fit. It's just too flat. It kind of continues that slightly ironic storage in a French car where you have places to put drinks, but not sure that's where they go. So that's in there. Got a little tray here. We do have these 2 cup holders here that actually fit a decent coffee this time, unlike Renault's past. Their new generation little fob key, which I don't think I like quite as much as the old one, does have its own little receptacle here. We have a sliding armrest here again with a nice stitching, but a fairly small hole here. Doesn't really hold much. Doesn't have any carpet or anything in the bottom of it either. In this Intens one here, I've got my phone sitting in the section that has wireless charging in the RS line, and we have 2 USB ports, a very old school auxiliary in port, and a 12-volt outlet, plus this climate control here with really easy to use twisty dials and stuff. All that stuff is really simple. It's not a difficult car to get your head around, but it's also not a complex car either. Renault has had a pretty strong story when it comes to safety. They've long had 5-star cars across their range, and the Arkana is another one of those. It doesn't have an excess of safety features, but it does cover all the basics, starting with things like front and rear parking sensors and a rear camera with guides and stuff, but it also has lane keep assist and with steering assist. It has rear cross traffic alert. It has blind spot monitoring. It has an overspeed assist function with a speed limiter and just here near the cruise control. It has adaptive cruise control with the distance here. The lane departure stuff is just here on these little toggles on the dash here, which makes it nice and easy near the steering wheel here. And just the general sort of way that all of that stuff operates is actually reasonably subtle, which is nice. As suspected by the length of the Arkana's wheelbase, there's a fair amount of room in the back seat here. I am sitting behind myself, so I'm not a hugely tall person, but there is still a reasonable amount of room, and I am really nicely elevated. It has that kind of theatre seating position that gives a nice view across the front, and a little bit amount of headroom. Like I imagine 6 foot or above would be close to touching the roof, but the sunroof does have a dip in the front of it there, so it doesn't sort of impede on the back too much. I should point out too that the sunroof's probably a bit more giving for the back passengers than it is the front. You can see out of it from here, but when you're sitting in the front seat, it's sort of over your head and behind you, which is kind of defeats the purpose, right? The seat itself is actually quite reclined. You are sitting quite back in the car, but the support of the cushion and the support of the backrest on your back, much like the front seats, is actually pretty good. I reckon you could do a fairly long distance in this car and not be uncomfortable. There is a lot of toe room for me here, even with the seat all the way down. The center seat here does have a bit of a tunnel in the middle here though, even though we're front wheel drive. We do have air vents here and a pair of USB ports and 2 switch blanks for God knows what. It just doesn't have that sort of classy look about the vents and a few of the other bits of plastic in here that kind of seems to be something that Mazda and Volkswagen are doing. It's definitely not quite to that level of chic. That said, the trim in the back here is just as nice as it is in the front. The stitching on the backs of the seats, which is vinyl, is pretty good. We have 2 netted map pockets here. We have a decent armrest in the door here and a matching armrest in the middle with a pair of cup holders and a 600ml water bottle holder in the door. Nothing out of the ordinary, but all pretty comprehensive. The official combined fuel consumption figure for the Renault Arkana is 6 litres per 100 kilometres, although on this test we averaged 7.9 litres per 100 kilometres, which is pretty good. Should be pointed out too that it can take 91 octane regular unleaded, although the fuel cap says 91, 95 and 98, so you choose. I'd probably choose 95. The warranty for the car is 5 years or unlimited kilometres, and it's also covered by 5 years roadside assistance if you service the Arkana according to Renault's recommended intervals. Those intervals are 12 months or 30,000 kilometres, and across the first 5 years, the cap price servicing total is $2,385. The thing about the Arkana that instantly caught my attention was just how positive it is to drive. The steering is really quite reactive either side of straight ahead and has quite a natural feel to it, and it adds this level of response to the car's change of direction and instant handling appeal that it totally does not share with the Koleos that's also built in the same factory in South Korea. So it's nice to know that this car's newer platform does bring dynamic benefits. Another thing is that it also feels like it has a shorter wheelbase than it actually does. It feels quite agile and surprisingly keen. And so around town, the Arkana is really quite a pleasant thing to steer. Now, the harder you push, it does tend to roll a bit because it does sit quite high, as we pointed out earlier, but nothing like vintage Renaults of the past. This sort of door handle scraping Renault 16s and Renault 12s is not repeated here in the Arkana, much as I would like it to be. It's just not. And I think that also having the car set up high like that so it doesn't roll too much does add an element of firmness to the car's ride, so it doesn't have that instant ultra plush old school French quality about it, but it doesn't ride badly either. In fact, the more that you ask of it, it generally seems to be pretty exorbitant. And even though this Intens is riding on 18-inch wheels, it's still not overly firm. It sort of deals with pattery surfaces pretty good, and it just has a general element of quality about the way that it drives although I think there's more road noise than there probably should be in a car that's essentially all new. This car was launched in early 2020 in South Korea and late 2020 in Europe, and it is on a pretty new platform that underpins two new cars. So I probably thought it would have been a bit quieter in terms of the amount of noise it transmits from underneath. Certainly the wind noise element and all that stuff is pretty good. Another thing that is also surprisingly refined is the engine. Now, the 1.3 turbo petrol engine under the bonnet of this car is a joint venture power plant done with Mercedes-Benz and Renault Nissan. And now in the A-Class and some of those other Mercedes-Benz models, it is really quite intrusive to listen to when it revs. But in the Arkana, it's not so much. I wouldn't call it inspiring, it's just not as offensive. In general, driving like we're doing now, we're in an 80 zone, cruising along, the torque is really pleasant. There's 115 kilowatts, 262 newton meters, pretty good for a 1.3 turbo, and certainly one that meant to run on 91 octane. It has a pleasant level of performance. Renault says 9.1 seconds to 100, which is ample for this car. It doesn't need to be any more than that. And it just has an element of sort of ease of driving at this sort of speed. It's when you sort of slow down for corners and go to add some accelerator response and then have this lag from the 7-speed dual clutch transmission that it starts to have a few holes in its sort of dynamic personality. You kind of feel like that the lag is then overcompensated for by the thing adding more acceleration and perhaps a lower gear than you're expecting. So there is an element or a degree of needing to be finessed with your right foot when you drive the car. You can also go through that multi-sense mode here and choose, you know, sport, or change the settings to do your own setting. But the one thing that you can't change is you can change the steering, you can change the cluster, you can change the lighting, you can't change the powertrain. And so I would want to have the powertrain, I think, in sport more often than not, because the steering probably doesn't need the weighting that sport adds, but the drivetrain could probably use that extra little bit of perkiness and a little bit more awareness of what gear it's in or where it's driving. That would just make it a little bit more pleasant to drive. The fact that you can't separate the two, to me, is a slightly annoying flaw. On the whole though, the Arkana is perhaps not as refined and as polished as it could be, but a little bit better to drive than you maybe expect it to be. And so it does have a little bit of personality, and it's certainly reasonably effective at what it does, but I don't think it goes beyond where it needs to be. It doesn't really offer anything beyond sort of the general expectation of what a small to medium SUV would do. And I feel like a car with a Renault badge on it deserves more charisma than that. So, what to make of the Renault Arkana? I think it's definitely a more interesting car than the Kadjar, which was competent but bland. I think in this instance, it has a few highs, it has a few points of difference, and it's a roomy car that's pretty nice to drive around town, that's efficient, and that is different. But if you look at its main competitors in the mainstream set that aren't, you know, dedicated coupe SUVs like a Q3 Sportback, it's like a Volkswagen T-Roc or a Mazda CX-30. And I feel like those two cars in particular have a level of an interior class and quality and polish about the way that they appear and the way they are to sit in that I don't think the Arkana can quite compete against. Different, yes. Competent, yes. Better, I don't think so. If you haven't subscribed, please do so below the video, hit the notification bell and leave a comment on the 2022 Renault Arkana Coupe SUV or on Chasing Cars. Thanks for watching.